Hi guys, welcome back to the Art of Server. So in today's video, I want to do an in-depth review of one of my favorite workstation motherboards from the IvyBridge era. This is a rather rare motherboard and it is the Supermicro X9DA7. If you've been with my channel since the beginning, you know that I often showcase rack mount servers like the Dell PowerEdge R series and Supermicro servers. However, over the years, chatting with people who come to my eBay store, I've come to realize that many people prefer a home server build using desktop PC form factors. That's the whole reason behind the videos I made about the HPZ workstations. This got me thinking more and more about components that would make for a great server build in a typical PC case. On top of that, most home servers are primarily storage servers, and this Supermicro X9DA7 fits that bill really well because it has an onboard LSI SAS 2308 based controller. So if you want to know more about this motherboard, stick around, and if you're just looking for specific information, use the timestamps in the description to jump to the relevant sections. Alright, before we get into it, please hit the like button for the YouTube algorithm so more people can benefit from the information I'm about to share with you. And if you're new to this channel and you're into building servers, subscribe and hit the notification bell so you don't miss my next video. Alright, now let's get into it. The Supermicro X9DA7 was released around June of 2012 and it has several sister boards known as the X9DAE and the X9DAI. But the X9DA7 is the only one with the onboard LSI SAS controller, so let's begin with decoding the name. The X in the X9DA7 means that this is a Xeon processor-based motherboard, and the 9 is for the 9th generation Xeon, which is the IvyBridge and IvyBridge generation of CPUs. The D signifies that this is a dual socket system, and the A in this case, as is with the X9DAE and X9DAI, signifies that this is a workstation class motherboard. Supermicro does use the letter A for other purposes, but with the X9 generation, the A is for workstation. Finally, the 7 refers to the onboard LSI SAS 2308 SAS controller, which is of particular interest to anyone building a storage server with this motherboard. Alright, let's talk about the form factor. This motherboard has dimensions of 12 inches by 13 inches, which Supermicro says conforms to the E-ATX form factor. Now, some time ago in a previous video, one of my viewers pointed out to me that E-ATX is not a real industry standard, so Supermicro E-ATX motherboards will certainly fit Supermicro server and workstation cases that support E-ATX. However, a consumer PC case that supports E-ATX may or may not fit Supermicro's E-ATX exactly. When I used a Supermicro X9DAI, which is an E-ATX workstation board, to build my daughter's computer in an NZXT PC case, I ended up having to drill and tap some additional holes for standoffs to mount the motherboard, so your mileage may vary. This Supermicro X9DA7 is based on the Intel C602 Patsburg chipset. In the consumer space, this C602 is equivalent to what you might know as the Intel X79, but of course with support for Xeon processors. And this board supports both Intel Xeon E5-2600V1 as well as E5-2600V2 processors. If you get one of these boards used and it has a BIOS version earlier than 3.0, you might need to get a V1 processor to update the BIOS to the latest version in order to support the V2 CPUs. Now, what makes this workstation motherboard special is that it supports Xeon CPUs with up to 150 watt TDP. This is not true of most Xeon motherboards of this generation. This means that this board is one of the few boards that can support the E5-2687W, V1 and V2 processors, which are Intel's workstation class CPUs that have higher frequencies. In particular, the E5-2687W-V2 is an 8-core 16-thread CPU with a base frequency of 3.4 GHz that can turbo up to 4 GHz. This was basically the Xeon equivalent to the Core i7 Extreme 4960X, but with 2 additional cores. So this board basically supports the top-of-the-line CPUs from about the late 2013 timeframe. Being from a IvyBridge and IvyBridge generation, this board uses DDR3 memory. Each CPU socket supports quad memory channels with 2 DIMMs per channel or DPC. This gives each socket 8 DIMM slots And being a dual socket system, you have a total of 16 DIMM slots. This system supports 3 types of DDR3 ECC memory: the UDIMMs, also known as unbuffered memory, RDIMMs, which are registered memory, and LRDIMMs, which are the load reduced memory. Now, I won't get into technical details of these 3 types of memory, but I will tell you this. 1, you cannot mix and match the 3 types of memory. You'll need to decide which type suits your needs best and use only that one type of memory. 2, between the 3 types of memory, UDIMMs are for low capacity and low latency use cases, but are often the most expensive. The largest UDIMMs are about 8 GB modules, and a fully loaded 16 DIMM configuration will max out at 128 GB. RDIMMs are for medium capacity and medium latency, but because these were the most commonly deployed, they are abundantly available on the used market and usually the most affordable. RDIMMs can be found in 16 GB and even 32 GB modules, and a fully loaded 16 DIMM system will give you a max configuration of 512 GB of memory. The LRDIMMs are for the high capacity but with higher latency and usually cost more per gigabyte than the RDIMMs, but are usually less than the UDIMMs. These are available in 32 GB and 64 GB modules, so a fully loaded 16 DIMM system can be maxed out to 1 TB of memory. The high memory capacity of the system also makes this board great for running virtual machines and containers. So even for a 10-year-old system, the maximum configuration on this board is quite the beast. Now, memory prices on the used market fluctuate all the time and also differ by region. But to give you a sense for comparison, here are some numbers based on the prices I found on eBay in the USA at the time I'm making this video. For UDIMMs, the cost per gigabyte is around $2.75 to $3.12 per gigabyte. For RDIMMs, it's about 82 cents to $1 per gigabyte. And for LRDIMMs, it's about $1.09 to $1.28 per gigabyte. So you can see from a cost perspective, UDIMMs don't make a lot of sense unless you really need lower latency. Typically, if you don't need more than 512 gigabytes of RAM, I recommend going with RDIMMs. Now, these various types of memory also come in a variety of speeds and voltages, and it can be rather complex and confusing trying to figure out what speed your desired configuration will or will not support. You certainly don't want to spend more money buying faster DIMM modules that will only clock down because your configuration can't run at that faster speed. So I'm going to walk you through the steps I recommend on how you can figure out what speed of memory to buy for this motherboard. So step 1, decide whether you will use IvyBridge V1 or IvyBridge V2 CPUs. The integrated memory controller between V1 and V2 support different speeds of memory, so this will be a deciding factor. Step 2, decide between UDIMM, RDIMM, or LRDIMM memory. I just described the different use cases and cost factors for these 3 types of memory, so if you missed that part, rewind to that part of the video and watch it again. Step 3, decide whether you will use 1 DPC or 2 DPC. That's DIMMs per channel. You'll have to factor in your desired total memory capacity and the size of the DIMM modules you want to use. Generally, 1 DPC will allow for faster speeds than 2 DPC. So if you want to use faster memory, consider DIMM modules with larger capacity so you occupy only one DIMM per channel. Now, step 4, decide whether you will use 1.5 volt or 1.3 volt DIMMs. The lower voltage DIMMs will save you a little bit in power consumption. However, it also limits how fast your memory can run. If you want maximum performance, you'll want to stick with the standard 1.5 volt and avoid the low voltage DIMMs. Okay, so finally, step 5. Once you've decided on those 4 factors, look up the tables in the Supermicro user's manual for the motherboard, and it will tell you the maximum supported memory speed for the chosen configuration. You will then know exactly what speed of DDR3 ECC memory is supported in your chosen configuration, and therefore what speed of DDR3 ECC to shop for. Alright, so let's go through a couple of examples. So let's say that we want to use a V2 CPU, an IvyBridge CPU, where we've decided on using RDIMMs, and we're going to do 2 DIMMs per channel, and we're going to use the 1.5 volt DIMM modules. So what speed can we run our configuration? So if you look through, so these are the pages from the Supermicro manual for this motherboard. And I specifically just took out the pages that are related to the memory tables. And so you'll see this is section 213. You'll have all these different tables here. And so first of all, we want to look for the tables for the V2 CPUs. And so you'll see right here, it says V2, V2. So this is a possible table we want to use. This does not say V2, so we're not going to use this table. And over here, we have one more table that says V2, and that's for the LR DIMMs. But we said we're going to use R DIMMs and not LR DIMMs, so we don't need that table either. So really, the only table we need right here is on this first page. And between these two, this table up here is for the U DIMMs, which we're not using, and we're going to settle with the R DIMMs. So this is the relevant table to determining what speed of memory we can run. All right, so now that we're narrowed it down to that table, remember that we said we're going to go with 2 DPC. And so these, if you look at the motherboard, we have these blue DIMM slots. That's the first DIMM for each channel. The black adjacent slot is the second DIMM for that channel. And so a pair of blue and black slots basically make up a channel, and we have 4 of these for each socket. So that's a quad channel, and we have likewise for the second CPU socket as well. So we said that we're going to go with 2 DIMMs per channel. So that means we're going to occupy both the black and the blue DIMM slots. And so we have to look here on this table. We're going to look under the 2 slots per channel, 2 DPC. Now under 2 DPC, we have 2 additional columns, and one is for the 1.35 volts and one is for the 1.5 volts. And you can already kind of see from the table here that the choices of memory speed for the 1.35 volt is a little bit more limited than the 1.5 volt. And so that's what I was saying earlier, that if you choose the low voltage memory, you will save some power consumption, but it will limit the performance of your memory. Now, we said we were going to go with 1.5 volts. So that means that the relevant speeds that we can use are in this column right here. And so now if you look at the various types of modules, we can choose. So for example, if we chose a dual rank 16 gigabyte module, then we certainly can run 1066, 1333, or 1600 memory speeds. Now, if we went with a quad rank 32 gigabyte module or quad rank 16 gigabyte module, that drops down now to 800 megahertz. So using the quad rank DIMMs will drop your speed down, but if we use the dual rank 16 gigabytes, we can stay at the fastest we can get is 1600. So that's, if we want the fastest speed possible in that configuration, we would go shop for dual rank 16 gigabyte modules to get that 1600 speed. All right, so let's do another example. Let's say that we want the 1866 speed, which is the fastest speed for this generation. And so this will be a little bit like reverse of what we just did in the first example. We're going to hunt for this 1866 and then figure out what will help us achieve that speed. So if you look at this table here, 1866 only shows up here, 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 and here. And so you'll notice it's exclusively in just this one column. And this column is the 1.5 volt column. So that tells you immediately we can only use 1.5 volt. And this is within the 1 DPC column as well. So that means that we have to limit our configuration to only 1 DIMM per channel. And that means we're only going to occupy the blue DIMMs and leave all the black DIMMs vacant. So that tells us that 1866 is now available in basically these 4 options, which are the 4, 8, 8, and 16 gigabyte modules in dual rank, single rank, dual rank, single rank. So basically, if we want the 1866 speed, we have to choose a dual rank 16 gigabyte module running at 1.5 volts and only have 1 DIMM per channel on the V2 CPU. And that's the only configuration that will support this 1866 at 16 gigabyte modules. All right, so hopefully that helps you guys out. I know this can be kind of confusing. There are so many I guess factors to consider when trying to figure out what memory speed is supported. So hopefully that helps you guys out. Next, let's talk about the PCIe slots. I know a lot of people tend to use their old desktop PCs that are laying around to build their first server, and although I can understand the mentality of repurposing some old hardware, one of the things that always bugs me about consumer PC motherboards is the scarcity of PCIe slots. This is why I often recommend people consider shopping for a used Xeon server or workstation class motherboard. The PCIe resources are just much more plentiful, and this X9DA7 does not disappoint at all in that regard. So from the first CPU socket, we have PCIe slots 1 and 3. These are PCIe 3.0 by 16 slots for your GPU or multiple GPUs. Now, although there is no physical slot, there are 8 PCIe 3.0 lanes that connect to the onboard LSI SAS2308 controller. So this CPU socket alone gives you the 16 plus 16 plus 8 for a total of 40 PCIe lanes connected to that first CPU. From the second CPU socket, we have PCIe slots 2, 4, 5, and 6. Now, slot 5 is another by 16 PCIe 3.0 slot, while slot 2 is an electrically by 4 slot and a physically by 8 slot. Slots 4 and 6 are both PCIe 3.0 by 8 slots. In total, we have 16 plus 4 plus 8 plus 8 for a total of 36 PCIe lanes. Now, I'm not sure why Supermicro didn't use the last 4 PCIe lanes available, since I know these Xeon CPUs can provide up to 40 PCIe lanes. But regardless, that's a total of 76 PCIe lanes. Now, one thing to make note of, you might see these 3 by 16 PCIe slots and think you might want to try out a 3-way SLI setup. But unfortunately, this motherboard does not support SLI at all. You can install multiple GPUs for CUDA or GPU application use, but not for SLI. If you want SLI support, you need to get the X9DAE sister board, which has support for at least 2-way SLI. Now, finally, I want to mention one last thing about the PCIe slots. If you are using the latest BIOS version, which is 3.3, you'll notice some options in the BIOS menu that seem to indicate that the PCIe port bifurcation feature is supported in these slots. However, this actually doesn't work, and I'm going to demonstrate that so you can see this for yourself. So let's go put this motherboard on my test bench and show you what I mean. Alright guys, so I got the X9DA7 installed in this Supermicro chassis, and I've got both processors populated. I have one DIMM module per socket, and this is just for test purpose, so we don't really need a whole lot. But what I have here in the first PCIe slot, which is connected to the first processor, is a P400 GPU, just so I can get video output on this, because there's no onboard video on this motherboard because it's a workstation board. And in PCIe slot 3, which is another by 16 slot, also connected to CPU 1, I have this Gigabyte Aorus quad NVMe adapter board. So in this board are 4 Samsung SM951, I believe, NVMe SSDs. And so this card requires PCIe port bifurcation in order to work. Otherwise, you're only going to see one of those NVMe drives. You have to have the PCIe port bifurcation set to by 4 by 4 by 4 by 4 in order for all 4 NVMe drives to show up in your system. So we're going to check that setting out. The setting is available in this motherboard, but it doesn't work. And so I'm going to show you what it looks like in the BIOS menu, and we're going to boot up into CentOS on my USB drive, and we're going to check how many NVMe drives we're actually going to see from this adapter. All right, so let's go ahead and power the system on. I've got the monitor up here. So I'm holding down the delete key to see if I can get in the BIOS menu here. All right, here we are. Okay, so you can see that I'm on firmware or the BIOS version 3.3 dated October 2nd, 2018. That's the latest one that I can find so far. So anyway, that's the version I have. And if you go to Advanced menu, and I believe it's under chipset, oh no, maybe PCIe configuration. Nope, sorry, not there. I think it's under chipset. Let's go there. South Bridge. No, not South Bridge. North Bridge. Integrated I/O configuration. Yeah, okay, here we are. So remember that I said the quad NVMe card is in PCIe slot number 3, right? So if you look over here, we have PCIe port bifurcation on IOH0, and there's IOUs here, and you'll see here is CPU 1, that's the first CPU, PCIe 3.0 slot 3. That's the slot where we have the NVMe drive, and I have that port set to, and let me go highlight that section. So I have it set to X4, 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 X4. The default, of course, is X16, which is just kind of the normal. So I'm splitting the 16 PCIe lanes into 4 by 4 lanes, supposedly. But like I said, this feature doesn't actually work. So the menu, actually, the BIOS menu with this update of the BIOS does have this section that seemingly suggests that PCIe port bifurcation is available. Now, some Supermicro X9 motherboards do have this feature and it actually works. For whatever reason, on this motherboard, it does not work. And so, but anyway, you see that I have it set up to X4, X4, and I have each of those X4 links set to Gen 3, which is fine because those Samsung NVMe SSDs are PCIe Gen 3. All right, so I have everything set up here correctly. Let's boot up and let's see how many NVMe drives we actually see. Okay, so I've logged into the system and let's do an NVMe check or NVMe list, I believe. And so you'll see that there's only one NVMe drive detected. It's a 256 gig drive. It's the Samsung. So one of the drives, it's probably the first drive that gets detected. The second through fourth drive simply don't show up. And so the PCIe port bifurcation is not working correctly with this board. And I've actually contacted Supermicro about this, asked them, you know, what's up with this, because the BIOS seems to indicate that PCIe port bifurcation is supported, but for whatever reason, it's not working. And their response was simply that PCIe port bifurcation doesn't work on this motherboard. And they said, yes, it does seem to work on some X9 generation motherboards, and for whatever reason on this one it doesn't work, and the product is end of life, so they're not really interested in releasing a update to fix this problem. So unfortunately we can't get NVMe the PCIe port bifurcation to work on the system. I have heard that it does work on some other X9 motherboards. I think supposedly the X9DA7, which is one of the sister boards to this board, it does not, that one doesn't have an onboard SAS controller, but supposedly the PCIe port bifurcation there does work. I don't know for sure, I'd have to verify that. But anyway, so there's some discussion online about this PCIe port bifurcation, especially on this generation of X9 motherboards. It's a little bit kind of hit or miss. And I just wanted to show you guys, kind of not just making a claim that it did work or didn't work, but actually showing you that it doesn't seem to work. Now, if somebody out there says, hey, I know what to do to make this work, please leave a comment down below and share it with us, because as far as I can tell, it does not work. All right, so anyway, just want to share that with you guys. Let's get back to the rest of the video. All right, guys, here's the part that makes this board a terrific storage server board: the Onboard LSI SAS2308 SAS controller. This is a native HBA controller, not a RAID controller that needs to be converted to IT mode. So even if you've been a bit hesitant about doing the firmware trickery involved in converting RAID controllers to IT mode, like I've shown in my X9DA7 video, You don't need to do that here. This should already have IT mode or IR mode firmware, and it's very straightforward to update or convert between the IR and IT modes. So the SAS ports for this controller are the two SFF8087 ports facing the front of the board right here. In many Supermicro server chassis like the 825, 826, 836, and 846, the fan wall that sits directly in front of this board will usually have an opening right here to allow SAS cables through to this exact location. However, if you're using some other server case, take into consideration whether there will be enough clearance for you to run SAS cables to this location on the motherboard. In tight spaces where the front of the motherboard might be up against a barrier, you might not be able to run the cables to these SFF8087 ports. This SAS2308 based SAS controller is a PCIe Gen 3 controller with 8 PCIe lanes. This supports up to SAS 2 and SATA 3 at a max link speed of 6 gigabit per second per SAS lane, and with the two SFF8087 ports, there's a total of 8 SAS lanes. This controller can easily handle any hard drive based storage, as well as SAS 2 and SATA 3 SSDs. However, one caveat with SATA SSDs is that SATA trim support via an LSI SAS controller is a very delicate matter. It requires the SSD to support features like deterministic read zeros after trim, which is not universally supported, and it also requires specific combinations of firmware and OS driver software in order to work successfully. Any one of these factors going out of alignment, say during an OS update, can break trim support. Now, trim aside, the SATA SSDs should work just fine, but if this is a concern for you, I recommend keeping the SATA SSDs connected to native SATA controllers like those right here. Now, SAS 2 SSDs do not have this problem as they use the native SAS unmap command. Speaking of SATA ports, this motherboard has a total of 8 SATA ports, but not all of these are equal. The ports that are labeled I-SATA are the normal AHCI SATA controllers, and I-SATA 0 and 1 are SATA 3 ports supporting up to 6 gigabits per second. These are the ports that you prefer if you're using SATA SSDs. The I-SATA 2 and 3 ports are SATA 2 ports supporting up to 3 gigabits per second. So these are really only useful with hard drives or any optical drives. The other 4 SATA ports are labeled S-SATA 0 through 3. These are ports from the Intel SCU or Storage Control Unit. These are all SATA 2 3 gigabit per second ports. On some platforms, Intel SCU can also support SAS drives, but in the case of Supermicro, that's not true. Only SATA drives are supported in these ports. Additionally, SCU SATA ports do not support optical drives. Next, let's go over the fan control system. There are a total of 8 PWM fan headers on this motherboard. At the front here, we have fan 1, fan 6, fan 2, fan 3, and fan A. Fan 1, 2, and 3 are primarily meant for chassis fans on the intake side. Fan 6 is for your first CPU if you're using an active cooler. And fan A is often referred to as the I/O fan, or basically a segregated fan control zone specifically for cooling the I/O cards, or in other words, the PCIe devices. If your CPU and RAM setup requires a different cooling profile than your PCIe devices that you have, this allows you to manage the fan controls separately and optimize for each zone independently. At the rear here, we have fan 4, 5, and 7. Fan 4 and 5 are meant for the chassis exhaust fans, and fan 7 is for the second CPU if you're using an active cooler. Next, let's talk about the USB ports. This motherboard has a total of 11 USB ports. On the back panel here, we have USB ports, or USB 2 ports 0 through 3, which are USB 2.0. These are good for things like keyboards and mouse and other low-speed USB devices. We also have 2 USB ports, or USB 3 ports, ports 0 and 1, which are USB 3.0. These are good for connecting external USB drives or other high-speed USB devices. On the motherboard itself, we have 5 more USB ports. First, there is the USB 4 port, or this is a USB 2, but port number 4, which is a Type A connector on the motherboard between the SATA ports here. Right next to it, over here, is a USB header for USB 2 ports 5 and 6, which are also USB 2.0. And near the front is another USB header for a USB 3 ports 2 and 3, which are USB 3.0. These headers allow you to connect to any front panel USB ports on your chassis. So by the way, the USB 3.0 ports are based on the Renesas controller, so it should be widely supported. So finally, let's wrap up and go over the rear I/O. So first, there's the serial port for those who may want to run a headless server. Now, because this is a workstation board, there is an onboard sound controller, and the line in, line out, and microphone ports are here. Next to that are 2 gigabit Ethernet ports, which are based on the Intel i350 chipset, and the rest are the USB ports that we already went over earlier. And finally, on top of the USB 3 port is a combination PS2 port. If anybody remembers those things anymore, you can plug in basically a keyboard and mouse to that USB port if you can somehow find a PS2 keyboard and mouse somewhere. All right, so some final thoughts. I think this is a great board for a server build, and really the only thing it lacks is out-of-band remote management like IPMI. But that's somewhat expected since this is really a workstation board. On the other hand, unlike many server boards, it supports the high-frequency CPUs like the E5-2687Ws and has a lot of PCIe slots, or by 16 PCIe slots. So tell me, would you use this board for your next server build? Let me know down in the comments below. Alright guys, this concludes my in-depth guide to the Supermicro X9DA7. I hope you found this video informative, and if you did, please smash the like button, and if you like this sort of content, subscribe to my channel and hit the notification bell so you never miss my videos. Also, if you'd like to support my channel, check out my eBay store. I have the greatest selection of pre-flashed HBA IT mode controllers ready for your TrueNAS, ZFS, and Unraid server builds. Check out the link down in the video description. All right, have a great day, guys. Bye-bye.